help me with this as I get through here? Can you talk and listen and talk to me at the same time? I didn't know if you came to hear this or not, but I'm going to force you into this. Frank, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to force you guys into my conversation.
And Mike, when people ask a question, if you can remember to maybe repeat their question,
Okay,
your answer,
or even their
so
comment.
they can hear.
Okay, I'll do my best. Okay.
You got a list of questions for me to ask?
Okay, way to go. I don't know how many, let me go ahead and do this first. I don't know how many of you are aware of the recent statistics show, but 76% of established American churches have either plateaued or in decline. Would you agree with that percentage, or at least that statement? 76% of American established churches have either plateaued or in decline. Can you help me try to explain that why? This is really dialogue. Frank, if you don't mind, Ray, anybody, can you explain why, if that's true, if you believe that to be true, 76% of churches are either plateaued or maintaining their own, what do I mean by plateaued? Just maintaining their numbers or in decline. Is there an explanation for that?
People are too busy.
People are too busy, Frank says.
My Boy Scout troop.
And what now?
I'm chaplain at my Boy Scout troop. We've been competing for years for sports.
Okay, okay,
Kids are not going in scouting.
okay,
Talking the other night.
okay,
We've got 7 boys coming up for each.
okay. So too much competition, Frank, with the world.
Right. I said, that's wonderful. But he said, we got to start a recruiting campaign.
Okay,
Because we're going to lose 7 boys this season.
okay,
But everybody's got everything else to do now other than going to church.
okay.
We've got so much competition out there.
So one of our people say, Frank from Isle of Wight Christian Church says, we just have too much competition out there. We're competing with so much. Ray, you got any ideas why I don't call you out? The majority of Christians are content. Ray, you're from Lynchburg says.
So they're not bringing other people.
Okay,
Because statistics prove new people are what bring new people.
okay. I love Ray's statement. Ray said,
If I could piggyback off of that.
let me quote for the
Yeah,
thing.
sure.
Okay, that new people, which is what we generate, bring new people. And so the church has to address the established churches. How do you get new people in? And we've been fighting that battle for 30, 40 years now. I'm sorry, Ron?
No, just piggybacking and overlapping, not an outward vision or mission.
Okay,
Now, in terms of what the church's vision is for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, is it an outward focused mission, or has it collapsed into an inward
okay,
focus?
okay. So Ron's thing actually is putting some blame on the church, that the church has become more inwardly focused, maintaining our own, rather than outwardly focused. How do we go out and get new people who then bring new people? I said of the 24%, when I said 76% of established churches are either plateaued or declined, of the 24% of growing churches, that's what it leaves us with, 14% of those are actually new churches. So the growing churches, at least of the 24%, the largest percentage of that are specifically new churches. And when I say new churches, churches that have been established in the recent 5 years or newer. That's what they considered in this statistic. So new churches do tend to grow because, Ray, you're right, new people bring new people. And so understand that. Of the 10% then, established churches, of that 10% that we would say, that remains 10%, are actually seeing, of that 10% are not actually seeing any kind of significant growth, if that makes sense. We're happy to be 5%, 10% growth. I don't know what your standards are. I know yours is a unique situation, Frank, when you told me you're in a situation where, you've got a dozen people and you're happy from going from 6 to a dozen. So that's 100% growth for you. But again, it's limited there. Ray, I know you've been established in Lynchburg for years. I know you fight the Liberty University, the whole Baptist. You've got to be honest. There's nothing in Lynchburg, but you've got to be the enigma there in there. But again, even in churches where we're rural, our growth is never really anything significant. We've never set our standards. Believe me, that's churches I preached in for years. I preached in 2 congregations that were very established, and we grew, from 100 to 200. We grew from 150, 200 to 250, and we were always content with that, because as long as there's more people than last year, I kept my job. People were happy. There would be new churches that would come in and instantly start growing, and of course I had to see that, I'm just being frank, as our competition, because they were doing something new, they were doing something different. And that's what was drawing. Even some of our people. A church came in and started the movie church idea. They started in a church. They did the whole thing from Willow Creek model. I mean, even the sermons, the bumpers and everything. And some people flocked there because it was the newest thing on the block. And so we struggled because we would lose one or two younger families to this new growth. And so sometimes I resented it, but sometimes I kept saying, well, what can we do here in my church, the church where I'm preaching? What can we do that they're doing to draw people? But we were traditionalists. And so it was hard for us to make any major changes. We went from traditional singing to a blended style of worship. And believe me, we fought battles over that. We went from a children's ministry, a youth ministry that was kindergarten to 12th grade, to where we divided in half and hired staff for the preschool through 6th grade, middle school, high school. People fought us on that. Why are you paying two people to do what one person could do before? And then, so it was that constant battle with an established church. Now, having said that, if you have, the truth of the matter is, if 76% of your churches are either maintaining what they have, barely, maintaining, or fading, and 24% of churches, mostly new churches, are growing, then how do we combine the two? That's the question that I think we have to ask. We do not want to do away with long-established churches. They have value. But at the same time, we've got to be honest, most of the growing churches are new churches, churches that have been established within the last 5 years or more. And so we can sit back and criticize, and that's what happens. We sit back in our traditional churches and we criticize, oh, they're compromising, they're doing this, they're doing that. And then the other churches are basically saying, this is a different church now. This is not your grandma's church anymore. And I hate to be honest with you, but Frank, for a new generation, that's what they're looking for. They're not looking to go to grandma's church anymore. They're not looking, and as much as it breaks my heart to hear this, they're not looking for the traditional hymn singing and things anymore. Why? Because they're listening to something completely different on the radio. These concerts are being packed out by people, both secular and Christian, singing music that they want to sing, but yet when they come to church, it's completely different. And so we ask ourselves then, how do we deal with the traditional church that's either plateaued or declining? How do we deal with the church that's growing only because it's new or because it's doing something different? And rather than criticize one another, what can we do then to remedy? Because the remedy is what? Or the ultimate goal is to win souls for Jesus. It's not to fill up your pews. Believe me, I'm a traditionalist. It's fill up the pews is what my church is trying to say, my traditional church. But my new church is saying, first of all, it's not about filling the pews. It's about changing people's lives. And so we're going from a traditional church, here's my point, to a transformational church. Because the new church doesn't care about traditions. They care about transforming people's lives. And I caught that. At first, I was a traditionalist and still am. Love the hymns, love knowing everybody in church, love the pews, let's just be honest. But I've also watched as a church grows, new people come in. And the unique thing is if you stay there long enough, you see those new people's lives change dramatically. I have watched men who come in gruff, cussing, tobacco chewing, and I'm serious. You can see the wad in their mouth. If not, you see it all over their teeth. And I'm not saying those things are sinful. I'm just saying we've been here long enough, 6 years, to watch churches where these men, and I watch men mostly, their lives have been transformed. They may not be the spiritual giants that we want them to be, but I can tell you they've come a long way in that transformational. And I think the church has been a part of that. I really believe that because they're there when there are men there and they're singing there. So anyway, my question I ask myself then is, how does the church that's about ready to either close their doors, and I don't know what the percentage of that would be, but Frank and I were talking earlier, if it wasn't for what some traditional churches had in their savings account, they would have closed their doors long before. Because why? They're not collecting enough to pay their bills anymore. And they're living off past money. And that's not wrong. In fact, I had a church in King William ask us that question. How long do we keep we're down to 26 people, but we have $100,000 in our savings. What do we need to do? Do we just need to sell our building and take the money and give it to a Christian organization? But then what do we do with our 26 people? Most of them are 70 or older. They can't drive any distances because I would say, well, come to us. We're 25 miles from you, 20 miles from you. We can't drive that far. We're not comfortable coming into town and things like that. So my answer with them, I don't have your answer. If I were your preacher, I'd say, like Frank is saying, we'll keep the doors open as long as we can keep these doors open, if only 2 or 3 people show up. And I love that idea, but then I've also got churches that are waiting to start new places, and you said this, Ron, do you sell your facilities, give the money to the kingdom work, and then do you help some new church, 5 years or newer, grow dramatically? I say dramatically, even if they get to 200, they're way past what you were at 25. They grow dramatically because of you, because the church saw their doors closing. I don't have the answer to that, but I'll tell you our story. And that's what Ron asked me to do, tell you our story and tell you how we believe that God led us to do something. It's not unique, but it was unique for us and our community. And so if you don't know what I'm talking about, when it comes to churches, let's just use the A and B model, for example. You've got Church A who's ready to close their doors. And you've got Church B just up the road. It can be up the road 2 miles or it can be up the road 20 miles. But you've got a church growing there. What do you do between those two churches? Does Church A just sit there and criticize Church B because they're growing, they must be compromising, does Church B just basically say to Church A, we don't necessarily agree that we're compromising, but yet we're doing a different work, a unique work, and do we just write them off? So I've had situations we've had where Church A can reach out to Church A, the church that's starting to close their doors, close to closing their doors, say to Church B, what can we do? And you've got a couple options. Number one, you can do what some people have said. You can sell your facilities. You can donate the money to here. Your people can come over here and we'll grow an even bigger work. Or you can say, can you help us? And Ron and I were talking about this earlier. Then this church sends a preacher over for them, maybe a piano player if that's what they needed or whatever. And you're just basically extending the life of that church. But Church B doesn't want to sound like I'm no better than you are. No, we'll help you continue to maintain. And then, Frank, you have what you do. We just continue to provide for them a preacher and a piano player so that they can keep their doors open. But understanding you're not going to do anything really significant growth-wise. You may be still ministering to people. And believe me, I don't think that's a wrong thing. I'm just saying that's been some possible solutions. Or, and here's my scenario C, Church A says to Church B, can we merge together? Can we come to you come to us, and can we merge together and do something even greater? Can we do things better together? Now, that takes a lot of gumption on both churches, but that's kind of the scenario that I found myself in about 7 years ago. I don't know if you know who I am. My name is Mike Lynn. I'm class of 85, so Roanoke Bible College. I still have troubles calling this anything other than Roanoke Bible College. But class of 85 together, we are here. And I, along with a young man by the name of E.L. Jones, I say young because he's 20 years my junior. I'm 64, he's 45, 46. We were trying to debate that just a moment ago. 20 years my junior. But anyway, we are the co-ministers at what now is called the Compass Christian Church, located in Mechanicsville, Virginia, just outside of Richmond. And for those of you who may not be aware, the Compass Christian Church is actually a merger of two churches that took place a little over 6.5 years ago. I was ministering at a church that's called Liberty Christian Church, 60 years in existence, well known in Mechanicsville, not so much for the church, but for the school. They had a Christian school that at one time was running as many elementary, kindergarten through 5th grade, that was running as many as 250 kids in their peak years, which was probably 90s to 2000, it was their peak years. Pole Green Church of Christ is a church that's located just a little over 2.5 miles away from us, has been there for over 100 years, the Pole Green Church of Christ. And so E.L. Jones, also a graduate of what was then called Roanoke Bible College here back in, let me get his date right. I told him I was going to make sure I got this correctly. Here we go, class of 2002. But E.L. was ministering there, had ministered there for about 7 years. Previous to that, he had been involved in some great youth ministries. But anyway, when we moved back to the area in Mechanicsville, my wife Landra, who doesn't want to be recognized today, and I'm in trouble for just doing that, I guarantee you. But anyway, this is her hometown, and she's always wanted to go back to Mechanicsville. And I grew up in the Tidewater area, and Mechanicsville 40, 30 years ago was very rural, and I just said, I don't want to live there, I really don't. And so we've kind of put it off. But one of the unique things that's happened over the last 40 years is Mechanicsville has grown substantially. it has become a suburb of the city of Richmond. We are what many would call a bedroom community of Richmond, Virginia, the state capital. A lot of housing developments. A lot of what used to be farmland has now been bought up and has become housing developments, which has brought with it a lot of people. Now, if you're a true Mechanicsville person, you have resisted that because all these foreigners or all these people have come in. If you're from outside of Richmond, or if you're moving into an area, you love it because you have the convenience of Richmond City, 20, 25 minutes away, yet you're rural enough. There's enough creeks, there's enough swamps, there's enough bridges that separate you from downtown Richmond. You don't have to go down there unless you have to. And so it's been a big draw. So that has played an advantage to us. And so one of the unique things that happened when I came back to Liberty Christian Church was that we were a church around 60, 65 people. A healthy church. It was not a struggling church, but it was a strong, healthy, but it had seen its better days. There were times when there were 250, 300 people, but we had a fondness for the Liberty Christian Church and the Liberty Christian School. Sadly enough, the school had closed, and the reason I have to say that is because when we got there, the school had closed, and so Liberty Christian Church, running around 60 people, had all these school facilities. There were 4 buildings that the school used. One was a gymnasium, and the other were classroom settings. And so they had all these empty these rooms when I got there, buildings with only 60 people. The church actually met in the front of the property, had its own building. And so one of the tasks that we had to do when we got there was, how do we keep these buildings from falling down? Because they were good use buildings, but they were falling apart because nobody was using them. But a church of 60 people could not afford to maintain those buildings and their church building. And so that was the reality of it. And so when I was only there 6 months, and we happened to be meeting with the elders, and we talked about some of the necessary things that we would have to do to these facilities, or else they're just going to fall apart. And so our fellows began to talk about the possibility of having to borrow money. And so a church of 60 people, to be honest with you, paying a full-time preacher, it's hard for them to think about any additional monies, but that had to become a reality. We could either let them deteriorate, or we could do something about the buildings physically. And just on a whim, and this is the truth, just on a whim, I happened to say to our elders who were discussing about taking a loan, we mentioned something about the Pole Green Church of Christ, 2.5 miles up the road. It's unique. They were in an opposite situation. They were a growing church, 100 to 170, 180, mostly newer families, younger families, because the preacher was a younger preacher. I think somebody said earlier in the leadership conference, a preacher has a 10-year span, both 10 years, we have a 20-year influence. If you're 50 years old, you can influence young people down to about 40 or up to about 60. There's that 20, and so you have to do. And so he was fitting that bill, 40 years old, preaching to people as young as 30, family, kids, so I said on a whim to our elders, have we ever thought about reaching out to the Pole Green Church, 2.5 miles up from us, young preacher, I know E.L. Jones, known him practically all of my life. Have we ever thought about reaching out to them and maybe asking them if they wanted to combine? I didn't call it a merge at that time, combine. Because we had all these facilities, but no people. And they had this group of people meeting in small facilities. And so it was almost a perfect fit. And originally my thought was, okay, we could hire E.L. E.L. was also not only the preacher, but he was also the worship leader at that time. And so my thought was, let's hire E.L. as our worship leader, our co-assistant minister, whatever. And then the unique thing was, and this is our story, E.L. had a children's minister because they were 30 kids. I had a middle school, high school. I had a youth minister, a volunteer in the church. But she was more concentrated on middle school, high school. She would have 15, 20 middle school, high schoolers, but we didn't have a lot of preschool, elementary ages. And so it was almost a fit. E.L. and his children's minister, Mike and his student minister, combining together. We had a full-time church secretary that we absolutely loved. We thought, what a perfect fit. And so my elders gave me permission. If you think E.L. would be, and their people would be interested, remember, they're a church that's been there for 100 years. They had just recently built a new sanctuary, home built by their own people, which held a very special place in their heart. Would they even consider something like this? And on a whim. And so they gave me permission, and I went to E.L. immediately the next week, knocked on his door, said, can we talk for a few minutes? He said, sure, come in. Again, we knew each other, but on a scale of 1 to 10, best friends with no friends at all, we're probably 2 or 3 in that, but we knew each other. And so he invited me in. He was very nice about it. And I just basically presented him, hey, we've been meeting over the last few weeks. We're really struggling. We have all these facilities. You have all these people. I hear you're getting ready to do some building. And he said, oh yeah, we are. In fact, here's the paperwork for this. We're getting ready to sign for a contractor and for a fundraising program. I said, well, before you do that, would you listen to this proposal? And I pitched to him, hey, you come over, you lead our worship, I'll do the preaching, we'll combine our staffs, we've got all these facilities, but EL, the challenge for you is, can you convince people who've been here for 100 years on this property to pick up and move, even though we're only 2.5 miles away, pick up and move to a facility that has more than enough space, but not enough people. So he said, let me pray about it, let me talk with my fellas about it. And that was July 4th week, real quickly. And so he called me back on Saturday and said, our fellas would be willing to talk. At least let's just talk. That's what we're presenting it. And so their group met with our group, our elders with their elders. By the way, he had 3 elders, we had 3 elders. We met, we discussed, we talked about all the possibilities. And I'm reading my notes. Things could not have gone better in that meeting. It was probably one of the most positive meetings that I've ever seen. Because here's a church and a group of elders who are at least listening to the possibility of what we could do together. And that was the whole premise. It wasn't save your guys $1 million, you don't have to build because we have the facilities, although that was certainly something that piqued their interest. But it was something that we share the same doctrine. We share mostly family, friends. Mechanicsville at that time was still a small enough area. Everybody knows everybody. And so there was this at least agreement with that. And to just kind of go through, if you don't mind, our story, what we learned and what we saw was that we truly believe that 2 churches that were maintaining, neither one of us were growing substantially, but we weren't ready to close the doors. 2 churches that were maintaining, we really began to believe the premise that we could do things better together. For 2.5 miles only separating us, we could do things together. And just a real quick timeline, if you don't mind. And I don't say this, please hear me when I say this. I don't say this to sound bragging, but I want you to see what God has done for us, because 2 churches were open to the possibility of maybe being able to do things better together. And so as I mentioned, in June of 2018, myself and our elders met. We agreed to reach out to the folks at Pole Green. Their ministers met with us. And as I said, again, just a wonderful meeting. From that meeting, we formed what we called an exploratory committee, which were members of both churches. I think we chose 7 members from each church, and we promised each other those 7 members needed to be crossed for age, economic. It had to be completely 7 different people, not your 7 favorite, your 7 different people. And so we had a young single adult, I think she was 23, 24 years old. We had parents of small children. We had older people who had been retired for years. And so their 7 and our 7, their 3 elders, our 3 elders, our 2 ministers, we met together and we began what we called an exploratory committee, because that's what we began to do. We asked ourselves in 3-hour meeting, what are the positives of us merging together? What do you see as a good outcome? And we got all kinds of positive remarks. What are some of the negatives that you see? What are some of the drawbacks? And of course, it was everything from leaving property that we've been in 100 years to churches, you're asking us to come over and your buildings are falling apart. We did it all. But then we turned it, and we always knew how to finish. Remember the sandwich idea? Start there, get to the meat of it, but then make sure so what can we do spiritually? How can we really influence this neighborhood? What do we have to do? And 9 times out of 10, the comments were you have to do things different. You cannot continue to be the same Liberty Christian Church and Pole Green Church that you once were. We have to be something different, which then opened up the door to renaming our church, and which also came up to the realization that we have to make some changes between the 2 churches. And so we began to commit ourselves that everything was on the table for change. We could not do it the way we've always been doing it because we were going to get the same results. We could have stayed Liberty Christian Church. We could have stayed Pole Green Church of Christ if we were going to continue to do what we've always done. And so we really said everything is on the table for change. And believe me, those were some hard conversations with those 20, 25 people. Because immediately somebody said, well, we need to change our name. And I was defensive because we invited y'all over here. You need to become us, not us become something different. But I realized that it needed to become that way. I'll be honest with you, the leaders from the Pole Green Church of Christ came back to us into the meeting and said, we like the merge idea, but we're not so sure about this Mike being the lead minister and EL being the associate who leads worship. Because, and this is what they said in defense of their minister, he's our minister. He's a preacher. I mean, he leads worship, but he's our preacher. And so they said, is there any chance that the two of you can co-minister together? That wasn't our original idea, but co-minister together. And of course, my fellows had to think about that. I had to think about that because that's not what I had in mind when I asked him. But again, our thought was, if everything is on the table for change, then preachers included have to be willing to adapt to that. And like I said, I knew E.L., I loved E.L., he was a great guy, but at the same time, I'm older, I thought, okay, I've got some experience. So there was that to overcome, but there were other things as well. Everything from Sunday school classes at merges, different ministries that they were offering, some of the ministries that overlapped. And are your people going to be okay with our people? And believe me, some of the Liberty folks had their own ministries and they were long established. And I don't know that they would have been as open to, but we kept telling everybody, everything's on the table, everything's negotiable. And I really think that's what opened up the doors for a lot of that. By the way, we did solicit some advice from Waypoint Ministries. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Tim Cole and their ministries, only because some of our people were saying, we can't be the same churches that we were. We have to be something different. And Waypoint Ministries, one of their primary objectives is to start new churches. And so they've been doing that successfully. And so we went to them and basically said, we want to start a new church with 2 established churches. We said everything's on the table. We're willing to change our name. We're willing to change whatever we need to do. And so they basically said, you need to, if you are going to reach young families, which Mechanicsville had grown substantially with, new housing developments and all, new schools that are being built, then you're going to have to model after some of the new church works they did. And so they were instrumental in coming in and helping us with everything from the neat thing was when we were going to open up our doors, we were treating it like it was a new church, so everything was new. So folks who came in from Liberty, folks who came in from Pole Green understood when you come in on that launch date, it's not going to be the same church anymore. Things will be completely different because we are a completely different church. And again, were they all thrilled about it? No. I'll be honest with you, when the votes came to merge the 2 churches, and by the way, I didn't mention that, we did vote both congregations. The Liberty Church, running about 60, 70 people, voted for like 97%. The church at Pole Green, running 170, almost 200, they voted at 91%. Both elderships had agreed anything over 80% we would move on with. We felt that if we could get 8 out of 10 people, it would be worth it to merge the 2 churches. And so we got into the 9, which just gave us a little bit of confidence in what we were doing. And so from that point, we launched in April 7th of 2019. Our opening day, there was like about 320 people because a lot of folks, Waypoint, other ministries, people came to see this merge. But within that first month, we averaged around 260 people, which was about the number of the 2 merges. If you say we were running 70, 80 people, they were running 200 people, that's about what the 2 merges. And so our hope was that if we could just maintain that for the first year, if we could just get our 2 congregations together and get along, stay together, we would be happy with that. But for whatever reason, God just continued immediately began to bless us from in those get there. My wife's
Tell
remind.
them about the immediate sale.
Oh, okay. So by the way, that 5 months that we voted from November to April when we were going to merge, we immediately began to make one of the unique things, this is again a Pole Green compliment, they had already had money saved for a building addition. I think it was $200,000 or $300,000 that they had saved for their building addition. They also knew they were going to have to sell their property. And so the unique thing was we took the money, cash day on hand, and began to immediately make the repairs in the 4 buildings that needed to be repaired, plus the gymnasium that the school used, we knew was going to have to become our worship area because the Liberty Christian Church in front of it could only seat about 150 people comfortably. And so we knew from the beginning, we would have to retrofit a gymnasium with video screens, because we knew we were going to have to modernize, with projection screens, with sound system. And so they spent well over that $200,000. We had to add additional parking, because again, a church was only 70 or 80 people. How do you get 250, 260 people? So a lot of that money was spent in that 5 months. We blended our staffs almost immediately after approval. E.L. and his I'd say his staff, he and her, came to our building and we began to give them room in our space. So at least for 5 months, even though we were still worshiping 2 different buildings, we were working together on a weekly basis. We started a midweek Bible study on the Liberty campus there immediately so that their folks could feel comfortable coming to we were still doing only the traditional Wednesday night Bible study, but we were inviting them to come over and share with us. We formed a new name committee. They came up with 160 different, they asked the congregation, what would you call this new work? We had over 160 submitted names. And this committee, the neat thing is we allowed this committee to narrow it down till they got to 6 different names. And then we presented those 6 different names to the congregation, and then the committee chose from that, because it was close. I mean, it wasn't just whoever gets the most, it's whatever can. Because it amazed me, we had to think through every name and how can we use that name. We had to see if the websites were available. I would have never thought that 30 years ago. But any name that was suggested, can we find a website for that? Can we use it? Can it be unique? Is it any different than any other churches? Let's call ourselves Community Grace. Everybody has Community Grace. Everybody has First Christian Church. We had to do something. It was really a process. We got it down to 6, got it down, finally chose one, told everyone, and they just stood in applause. Compass Christian Church. Again, I wish I could tell you all the discussions that went in there, but we completed the legal work. There was legal work that had to be done. One of the unique things that happened is when Paul Green, and my wife mentioned that earlier, was able to sell their property. It was in demand. They were able to sell their property, and I don't mind saying for well over $1 million, sell their property almost immediately. But what they had to do, since it was Paul Green Church of Christ and Liberty Christian Church, and Compass hasn't even been established yet, we had to deed the property over to Liberty Christian Church, who then sold the property, and then we had to do the paperwork so that Liberty and Paul Green are now known as a DBA, if you're doing business as Liberty Christian Church. That way, any contracts, anything that Paul Green had been involved in was still in force. Anything that Liberty had committed themselves to was still in force. That's what a DBA allows you to do. But yet we could, from that point on, treat ourselves as a separate entity. And it answered a lot of problems for us. And then, as my wife said, and by the way, I've got to say this because people hear, and you'll hear some statistics here in just a second. It's a whole lot easier to do new church work when you've got $1 million in the bank. This is how God has blessed us, honestly. What made it easier for us, money was not an issue from the very beginning. Why? Because we believe that God was in this from the very beginning. From the conversation between 2 preachers, to the conversation between 6 elders, to a group of committees getting together and doing nothing but positive talk. Nothing but what can we do together? By the way, that committee really quickly said there's some things that we need to do together before we even vote. And so they had they called it taco night, but we're going to talk about the merge, taco about the merge. And so both churches came into the gymnasium. We did everything on the Liberty campus so that they would see what they're getting, the folks from Paul Green. And so we did. We presented everything that we had come up with so far. And we just asked people to embrace it. There were pulpit swaps. Now, we knew each other, we knew churches each other, but I don't know that we formally had been in each other's churches. And so we made 2 Sundays, 2 different months, where I actually went over to the Paul Green Church, introduced myself to some people for the first time and preached for them. E.L. came over to the church where I was ministering, did the same thing. We waited to hear what the response was going to be for the next several weeks before we scheduled the next one, because there are going to be some people who may say, we're not going to have anything to do with that one. But fortunately, we didn't catch that, so we did a second one. At least that way our people got to see this is what you're getting. And then we also, in addition to that, I think that was it, formed a new name, did the work. So we launched I mentioned in April. By the next February, we began a second service, because at that time we seated 300 comfortably. And so our numbers were already getting there. So we said, well, let's start a second service. And that's what we did. And that allowed us to duplicate the same room setup for a second group, the same music. Everything was identical. We just took a half an hour break for those involved in the service, and you just did it again. I know some of you are used to multiple services. We had that when I was in Ohio, but we had a traditional service. And then we had what we called a contemporary service. So we had 2 different people. This was a complete duplicate. In fact, we said from the beginning, we're not looking to do two different styles. We're looking to do the same thing twice. That way, if you can't make 9 o'clock, you can make 10:30, and it will be the exact same thing. And we had already determined that we were going to make the music changes, and we weren't going to resort back to traditional music and have to fight the battles that, if you've ever been in a church that has that, as much as we tried, there was that constant battle between traditional worship folks. And when we would try to have a joint Easter service, the first question to ask was, what kind of music are we going to have that Sunday? And our worship people had to strike that balance between singing a hymn, and it was just, so we just said from the beginning, this is what we're going to do. So in February 2020, we launched our second service, because by then we were averaging close to 600 people. So from 260 within less than a year, 600, because we opened up the second service. Anybody remember what happened in March of 2020? 1 month after starting the second service, COVID hit. Not just COVID, the restrictions hit. And if you remember, the restrictions were, at least for the first month of March, was no services at all. And so we were so blessed with younger people. This is where I give a compliment to younger staff. We immediately said, what are we going to do? The problem wasn't, what can't we do? The question was, what can we do? And so where churches were asking that question, traditional churches during COVID, well, what can't we do? Well, we can't sit together. We can't do this. We can't do that. Our folks were asking, what can we do? Well, here's what we can do. Why don't we go outside? We've got, remember, we used to be a school. We've got this soccer field behind us and all this property. Can't we do an outside service? And we'd heard churches were already doing that, so we jumped on the bandwagon. We got the little system that allowed you to speak into a microphone, a box that allowed you to go to your cars then. And so we started inviting people for a drive-in service. I know other churches were doing it, but it was our quick pivot. Within a matter of 2 weeks, we had bought the equipment, we were meeting out on there, and we were averaging at first probably 60, 70 cars. Next week it doubled, I'm not exaggerating. The next week it doubled, because not only were our people coming, but many churches that had been shut down were coming. And so they were coming for worship, not so much because we want to be a part of your church. You're one of the few churches that are still having services. And so we just welcome, glad to have you here. Third, fourth week, it just continued. All of a sudden, somebody mentioned tailgating. Hey, this is almost like going to a football game. Really, within 3 weeks. And there were people who were saying, why don't we tailgate after the services? And we said, okay, as long as you honor the restrictions of that. That means you can't walk up on people, but you can cook in yours, you can cook in. And it just became this, honestly, I can't tell you the excitement. Smelling all this, grills going during preaching was hard to preach. One service, by the way. But you would smell all this, and people, it was a magnet for the community. And I think within 6 weeks, they allowed us to go back in. And from then on, then we said again, we're going to meet back inside. But fortunately, we had bought chairs rather than pews. And we just basically put 300 chairs out there and said, sit where you're comfortable. Don't break the law, but if you rode together in church, we're not going to make you sit 6 inches apart. You rode together. You're laughing, but I know of one church, if 4 of you came in, you had to sit to your spouse, and you had to be 6 feet from your spouse, even though you just rode in the car, because that's where they saw what they couldn't do. What we said is what you can do. You can come in here. You can sit with those of you who rode in. If you're not comfortable, then you sit someone else away from somebody. And so there were people who were sitting close together, but there were people who were in the corners because they wanted that distance, and we respected that. Anyway, it began to snowball from there. We went back into indoor services. We only averaged about 300 on that first couple of weeks, but we had noticed that our online presentation had grown dramatically. When I say dramatically, I'm talking about from 10, 12 people listening online to 30, 40, 50, 100, 150. And so what we started to do was, maybe we need to invest in online services as much as our indoor services. And that's what we did. We bought the equipment. Over the next few weeks, we began to try to record programs that could be reshown. We just put a lot of effort into the online services. That allowed us in October to start back our second service, because the numbers were coming back in, but yet our online service had improved dramatically. I'll do this quickly. 2 years later, we grew to the point where we began our third service, an early morning service. We thought, okay, 9:30, 11 has become the family. Let's start an 8 o'clock service, and we didn't provide childcare or anything. Those of you who don't have children, those of you up early, which tend to be the older people, let's be honest, we're up, we're ready to go. Why don't you come at 8 o'clock, and that will open up 9:30 and 11 o'clock. And so folks did that. We grew that meeting to about 250. We grew to that point. So we added the third service. And then January of 2025, this past January, our numbers increased. By the way, we took 300 chairs. We stuck another 100 chairs in there. We stuck another 100 chairs in during the growth. We stuck another 76 because 567 chairs is all we can do without the fire marshal coming and shutting us down. And so if you come in on Sundays, you can literally count 567 or 76 chairs in, because that's the max we can do. And God has just continued to bless. This past January, we started our 4th service, an afternoon service, 4:30 in the afternoon. We did that for several reasons. First of all, our worship people needed a break. You can't go for 6 hours straight without a break. Go home, get you some lunch, come on back. They were willing to do the same thing all over again. Preachers-wise, the same thing all over again. And so we reached out what we thought was the different dynamics. We told people, again, if 9:30 doesn't work for you, 11 o'clock, here's 4:30. Your kids are up, you've been up. And so we pitched that we could move people to the 4:30. And what we've noticed since January, we're running around 250 to 300 now in that 4:30 service. But what we've noticed is it's not people who have moved from 9:30 and 11. It's completely new people. It's people who are telling us, I work in the morning, it's great, I heard about this church service. We have older people who say, I just can't get up and get moving in the mornings. And so physically they finally get to and so they're there at 4:30. We have this different dynamics. And then we have a lot of families who are coming back from the river. We live about an hour from Rappahannock River. And so folks have a lot of river homes down there, or they're down there for the weekends. They can stay all morning and come back and go to church and then go home ready for school the next day. We didn't realize that was going to something, but it answered some of that. And so it's provided for us that. Now, what has happened, and I just want you to catch this, and I say this in my notes, and I promise I'm almost done. This is not to brag. Please understand this. This is what has happened because 2 churches came together and were willing to try and do better together. January, we started our 4th afternoon service, a church that 6 years ago started with 260 people. Easter Sunday, this past Easter Sunday, we had over 3,000 people in worship. I'm not exaggerating our numbers. Now, I know Easter's a big number, but let's be honest, in a church of 250, if we have 350 on Easter, we are thrilled. I mean, we are. Here's a church that on Easter Sunday, and we really pushed it because we wanted a lot of folks to meet our church for the first time, because people will go to church on Easter. They'll go on Christmas and they'll go on Easter. They'll go Christmas Eve. So anyway, we over 3,000. Our Vacation Bible School this past year had over 440 kids every given night. Kids. That's preschool, elementary only. Over 400. We had over 220 adults volunteer every night. What would have been a tremendous Vacation Bible School in my other churches, 220 kids, we had in volunteers alone. That's how we convinced people that we are a children's ministry church. Our cruise-in, I don't know if you know what a cruise-in is, but about 3 or 4 years ago, we formed what we called a church event where we would invite people, a car show. Bring your cars, mechanics for your cars, and we want to collect money for a needy family in our community. And so the first year we found a child who had cancer, and we took up a donation over $35,000 for that family the first year. We were thrilled by that. We gave directly to the family, no strings attached. The next year we did the same thing. We adopted a family, we promoted it better. I think there was probably $55,000 raised. Third year, we did this a year ago, we did another family, we were able to raise almost $80,000. Now, we felt like that $80,000 was a lot to give to one family with no strings attached, but we did it. We honored our request. We just didn't know that it was going to multiply. And so we did this past September, just a little over a month ago, 5th year, I think that we've been in this. We chose 2 families this time, just because we knew the challenge. We'd rather split. To date, we've collected over $110,000 for 2 different families. A church 6 years ago, honestly, a church 6 years ago, $110,000 was our budget. That was our yearly budget. And now we collected that in one day for 2 needy families. And again, I don't say that to brag. Please don't misunderstand. This is what will happen. Now, during the process, and I close, the 3 key factors that we have preached to each other, staff, elders, leadership, was number 1, that God is in control of this. When people say, man, look at your church, we have to parrot that God is in control of this. Because the moment we start taking credit for that, I think God is disappointed in us. And so you will hear me say, and I'm not just brushing it off, or EL, or any of our leadership. Man, I can't believe what's happened. You went from 260 people to 3,000 people in 6 years because God is in control. I wrote specifically, we've said time and time again, every time we've had to deal with an issue, and every Monday staff meeting is a reaction meeting. It's not about what we're going to do this week. It's about where did we fail last week. And when people would ask us, what are you going to do when you get to 500? What are you going to do when you get to 1,000? We just kept saying, God is going to figure that out for us. That was our famous line. Some people are flustered or frustrated when you tell them that. But that was our mantra, because we believe God is going to take care of this. God is going to show us what to do. And we believe that. Number 2, there were no sacred cows. Now, if you're in church work, you know exactly what that means. But if you don't, that means that everything is open to change. When people would complain about some of the changes, I heard this from David Vaughn Jr. years ago when he was at the Great Big Church of Christ and made all those changes. When people come to us and say, oh, this has changed, I don't like this change, our response was, well, hang on, because we're probably going to change it again. That was our joke, but that became what we would say to them. I know you're not happy, so hang on, because we're probably going to change it again, because we had to constantly pivot because everything was open to change. Number 3 was no pride. No pride, no ministers taking credit, no elders taking credit, no staff taking credit. God was doing this. I know it sounds like God is in control, but what we were telling them is that we're not controlling the growth, we're not controlling God. But what we wanted to make sure that we personally were saying was that we're not doing this, God is doing this. And there were times when I would catch EL, and there were times when he would catch me, or we would catch some of us start saying we, and we'd say, no, don't say we, say God. God is doing something unique here. And I know that sounds almost, maybe to some of you, ridiculous, but it's the mindset that you've got to realize you don't have anything to do with this. You just happen to be the tool that God used to ask the other preacher, or to say yes, or to give, I just want you to hear us that. And so I hope we live by that. I just realized somebody's up behind me. And we say this in our staff meetings, we'll solve this together. Our staff meetings are very important. We meet and we discuss what happened this past weekend, what mistakes we made, what can we do next. Everybody is part of the solution. When the children's ministry says, we're packed, we don't have this, what can we do? It's 6 or 7 people at the table. We don't just tell you figure it out, because it's frustrating when you have to figure it out all by yourself. But when the purpose of that meeting, and sometimes those meetings go 3 hours because we want to know and we get some silly suggestions. I think we ought to do this. Why don't we put people up here? Why don't we do? But before we leave the room, we've got it figured out. And we tell ourselves, we go back to, God just figured that out for us. But we made sure that everybody had a voice in that room. And so you don't feel isolated. I don't know how you do your staff, but you've got to meet on a regular basis so that you can be on the same page. And it's neat to hear the victories that some of the ministries are having that we would not have heard had we not been in a group setting like that. But then there's also that transparency. Pray for us in this. We're really struggling. We've lost people here. People have gotten mad and people have left. And so I think there's strength in numbers, and there's wise counsel that comes in numbers. And so what the future holds, and I'll close, we've learned throughout this process that only God knows. We just need to be prepared to react. But it all began, and here's what I want to make sure it all began because 2 churches were bold enough to say, hey, what do you think about us trying to do this together? And I don't know who I'm speaking to, but I can't help it with all the rural churches that we have in Virginia and Carolina, churches that are just 5 and 10 miles from each other. Wouldn't it be bold just to go up and say, listen, we're struggling to keep our doors open, or we're just maintaining what we have, and you're doing the same. What would happen if we came together? And whether we come to you or you come to us or we go to somewhere neutral, what would happen? Well, there'd be an instant spark just immediately because you're doing something new, something different, something that's not taking a lot of effort or energies. Now, I know it takes a lot for people to compromise. That's why you got to have strong leadership who say, we want to do this for the best of the congregation. You got to have ministers who are willing to co-minister together, or in some church situations where a church doesn't have a minister and a church does, that's ideal then. Why don't you come over and be a part of us? Or why don't we meet somewhere? And I just think it's unlimited, but it's in your court to do so. I've taken someone else's time. Thank you for letting me share. Again, please understand our story is very unique, but if it presents a possibility of whether someone in this room or someone watching this to maybe reach out and ask another church, hey, what about the possibilities? Maybe God will do something unique there too as well. Thanks for letting me share. God bless, folks. Thank you very much.